What is queer archaeology? Queer archaeology consists of several different aspects under one umbrella. It is not necessarily just the study of LGBT people in the past, although it can be used to help identify them. Queer theory is used in archaeology to challenge heteronormativity, which is the assumption that relationships and society are heterosexual in nature. This includes breaking down harmful concepts like the nuclear family, binary gender, and female inferiority. It also provides fresh perspectives on art, identity, representation, and the body for archaeologists to broaden their understanding of the past. Queer archaeology does not concern itself with the origins of homosexuality, nor is it a manifesto for promoting homosexuality above heterosexuality. The history of queer theory. Queer theory in general has its roots in feminist theory and has somewhat taken up the mantle of being the critical perspective in many social sciences. Being queer is defined by its opposition to the heterosexual norm, whether that is sexual preference, gender, biological sex, or asexuality. This is because queer is an inclusive term that aims to incorporate every identity that may be marginalised by a normative society. This is also because queer theory didn't rise to popularity until the late 1990s, meaning that it's still a young school of thought. Often, when different perspectives are brought into social sciences, they begin by establishing exactly why they are different from what came before, which is exactly what happened with feminist theory. In the 1960s, second-wave feminists wanted to bring female perspectives into disciplines like politics, sociology, anthropology, and of course archaeology, since the experiences of women had been massively neglected in these fields. This broadened the disciplines and improved our understanding of the past by presenting a different outlook and providing ways for archaeologists to study more people in society. Pioneering works such as Elizabeth Brumfiel's study of Aztec figurines showed us how women acted as free agents in the past, who often defied established conventions or political stances that they disagreed with. Application of feminist theory to these disciplines resulted in a long overdue celebration of what women did in society and mirrored the incursion of modern women into academia and other traditionally male professions. Over the years, the focus moved from feminism to gender more generally, as more and more assumptions were challenged. Nowadays, gender is a widely studied topic in the social sciences that isn't limited to women. This predicts a similar trajectory for queer theory as it matures as a field. How can queer theory help archaeology? The most obvious benefit to incorporating queer theory into archaeology is being able to consider queer identities in the past. This means we can challenge inaccuracies that have been posed on archaeological evidence from a heteronormative perspective. An example of this is the Manicurist tomb from the 5th dynasty of Old Kingdom Egypt, in which two high-status men were buried in an elaborate tomb. There has been a lot of debate over the depictions found on the inside walls of the tomb, in particular this image at the entrance to the offering chamber. This embrace is usually only seen in heterosexual married couples in ancient Egyptian art. So from a queer perspective, we might assume that these two men were in a long-term relationship of some sort. Previous interpretations have suggested that they were brothers or twins, which seems unlikely given the intimacy of the depiction. Queer theory has therefore helped in this case to improve the accuracy of our interpretations by correcting prior heteronormative assumptions and has many more applications to other archaeological evidence. We can also think about queerness in the past through the lens of performativity. This is a concept originating from feminist theory, which suggests that parts of your identity such as gender, sexuality, ethnicity, etc. are performed using material means, like the clothes you wear and the objects you own. In using and displaying these objects, you not only express yourself to others, but relive your identity. This forces you to reassess how you feel about it and how you perceive yourself from within society, thus ensuring that your identity is forefront in your mind. We can develop ways of analysing a person's belongings that allow us to suggest what their identity might have been, according to cultural styles. We can define the gender norms for a given society by examining associated grave goods found with skeletal remains, as we can determine biological sex from these remains. If specific objects are frequently found with female remains, for instance, we might conclude that these are used in the construction of womanhood. A mixing of differently gendered objects might suggest that this individual laid somewhere between the gender binary or adopted different gender identities at different times. Material culture would therefore be integral in those cases for allowing the individual and society to distinguish between their gender identities. Queer theory has also provided the idea of fluidity in archaeological investigations, which is often useful when studying prehistoric populations. It's widely believed by European prehistorians that gender was more fluid in the Neolithic, for instance, with people adopting different gender identities based on situation, whether this is during a ritual or more long-term in order to fulfill a different role. Sexuality can also be fluid, which is important to remember as this likely took place in the past too. In hunter-gatherer societies, people might have been polyamorous as a way of managing risk, since having more adults in a household allows you to obtain more food and care for children better. This suggests that bisexuality and pansexuality might have been more normalised in these societies as a way to form stronger familial units and ensure survival. Of course, fluidity in gender and sexuality doesn't have to have a rational reason for its existence. Sometimes people in the past would have just had queer identities because they were born that way, just like in the present. But it is easier to see causes and impacts via archaeology than to investigate random variation. How can queer archaeology help modern LGBT+ issues? By presenting queer identities in the past, archaeologists can legitimise their validity as a historic phenomenon rather than a modern invention, as some queer-phobic rhetoric might suggest. This helps to combat the false assertion that being queer is unnatural, since if these identities were present in the past without the proper vocabulary to describe them, then they are part of natural human variation. It also helps to prove that modern queer labels are just to identify already familiar identities rather than constructing new ones. Studying queer identities in the past also makes archaeology as a field more accessible to queer academics and students, since many will choose this as a field of interest for research. This also exposes non-queer people to a wider variety of different perspectives, which not only improves their understanding of past societies, but also makes them more likely to respect their queer colleagues, and having queer representation in the past promotes a more collaborative working environment within archaeology departments at universities. This is true for other types of representation as well, with the insurgence of queer theory into archaeology occurring alongside feminist and post-colonial viewpoints. This reframes considerations of sexuality, gender, and ethnicity as a celebration of difference rather than emphasising separateness. This expression of solidarity is really important for marginalised groups. Issues with queer archaeology. As archaeologists, we have to remain careful. It is very difficult to apply modern LGBT+ identities to people in the past. We have to remember that even though a past individual might identify with one of our modern labels, they probably didn't think of themselves that way at the time. Adopting a definite stance can have other unintended consequences too, an example being the Burka Viking burial, which is a warrior burial that was once considered to be a male but was confirmed by DNA analysis in 2017 to be chromosomally female. Was this individual transgender and therefore adopted a male role in society to match their gender identity? Or were they a woman who simply subverted established gender norms? If we assert that they were transgender, this might devalue the feminist argument and reinforce gender binaries in the process, since we are suggesting that only those who acted as males could have been warriors. On the other hand, if we emphasise their biological sex, this ignores the gendering of the grave with weapons that would suggest a male gender identity. The handling of this case is still very contested, and it is unclear which approach is the best to take. Another problematic part of the field is the tendency to ignore intersectionality. This is the idea that individuals who belong to multiple marginalised groups experience unique forms of discrimination, often due to several different prejudices being imposed at once. For instance, a queer black woman would experience 3 disparate sources of prejudice at once, which combine to form a unique experience of oppression. This is difficult to access in many archaeological cases, but is certainly possible for historical archaeology, probably in conjunction with post-colonial theory. Intersectionality between gender and sexuality might even be accessible in prehistoric contexts, but the theory has been poorly engaged with so far. Ultimately, the biggest problem with queer archaeology is that it isn't prevalent enough in the discipline yet, but with more interest and encouragement for queer people to move into academia, this may be about to change. More engagement with queer theory from academics regardless of sexual orientation would also be beneficial for the field and for wider LGBT+ issues, as this video has demonstrated. Overall, the benefits of queer theory outweigh the problems with it, so the future looks bright for queer archaeology.